Well, good evening and welcome to, I guess this is our fifth session for those of you that are coming to our speaker sessions for ECCE. Just a reminder for you tonight, the reminder that we always give to you. And first of all, thank you for sliding to the middle here so we have room for our late arrivals. We appreciate that, so we have nobody standing. Fire code doesn't allow us to. We're just not trying to be mean to you. Fire code doesn't allow us to do that. So just a reminder, we want to display good etiquette, good manners to our presenters tonight, so make sure you are silencing your devices and putting your attention forward so that we can show our presenters of the best that we have here at UIS. But tonight we have the Navy Censored My Book presentation by Jason Pierceson and Emily Knox. I think an exciting evening for you. So let's do a little introduction of our, oh, and by the way, I'm not Deanna, if you haven't figured that out by now, okay? She could not be with us tonight, so I drew the short straw, and I am your MC here kind of tonight. My name's Rod McQuality. I am one of the instructors for 301. Some of you have me for that session, so I will be doing the moderating here tonight, so bear with me. But let's meet our presenters that we have for tonight. Dr. Pierceson is a leading scholar on LGBTQ rights. His book, Sexual Minorities and Politics, is the first textbook to provide a comprehensive overview of the historical, political, and legal status of sexual and gender minorities. For this reason, sexual minorities were placed on the Navy's professional reading list in 2021. However, the Navy removed sexual minorities from the list in 2022, along with other books about race, gender, and sexuality. Jason Pierceson received a PhD in politics from Brandeis University and is a professor in the School of Politics and International Affairs here at UIS. He is the author or co-author of 7 books and an encyclopedia on LGBTQ politics. Dr. Emily Knox received her PhD from Rutgers University School of Communications and Information, and she is an associate professor at the University of Illinois. Her book, Book Banning in the 21st Century America, aims to contextualize and help us understand the motivations of people who ban books. Dr. Knox recently testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary on September 12th. She was one of 5 witnesses offering testimony for the hearing Book Bans Examining How Censorship Limits Liberty and Literature. We also have with us Dr. Magic Wade. She is an associate professor here in the political science and the director of the School of Politics and International Affairs here at UIS. She received her PhD from the University of Minnesota, and her research and teaching focuses on state and urban politics, criminal justice policy, and community firearm violence, especially in small and mid-sized cities. So first of all, let's welcome them with a nice round of applause for our presenters tonight. Dr. Pierceson, I believe you are starting with us tonight?
So, yes.
Okay, all yours. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to everyone for organizing this, especially Professor Wade. It was her idea. She put this together, so we wouldn't be here without her initiative on this for this event. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what happened with my book in the Navy. It's not the most catastrophic thing to have happened to a person, but I think it's emblematic of some of the issues that have been going on the past couple of years about book bans and how it is connected to larger ideological political fights in society. So this book came out in 2016. It's a pretty general overview of the history of the LGBTQ rights movement, political theory, public policies, and courts. It was designed mostly to be a textbook for classroom use, although I think it has broader appeal as some folks in the Navy saw. The book itself isn't necessarily a both sides kind of book where it gives equal time to people in favor of LGBTQ rights, people against. It does explore barriers and opposition to LGBTQ rights. But I take the position of my scholarship and in this book that sexual and gender minorities are worthy of respect and recognition, and I don't necessarily privilege anti-LGBTQ perspectives in that conversation. And it was in early 2021 when I got an email from a student journalist, someone like many of you, from the University of Pennsylvania, asking me what I thought about my book being added to this Navy recommended book list for sailors. And I didn't know what they were talking about. I'd never heard of it. The Navy had never contacted me about it. So I did some Googling and I found the website where the Navy had this, and I never replied to that journalist because they were also from a more conservative media outlet called Campus Reform, that thinks college professors ought to brainwash students, so I wasn't going to reply to that. I didn't think it was the fairest journalistic source. So I let that go, but I let the university know what happened, and they put out a press release, and it was kind of a neat thing. And things went pretty well for a while. But then, soon after that, a couple of members of Congress wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy. And two members of Congress, Vicki Hartzler from Missouri and Lamborn of Colorado. And they actually objected to the 3 books that were on that list, 2 beyond mine, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the new Jim Crow in addition to my book. Now I should note that these other books are more influential and important and famous than mine is, so I was in good company. I was kind of surprised to be in such company, but I think the Navy was trying to broaden its appeal and look for a good book for sailors that might have explored the history of the LGBTQ rights movement. That's my speculation anyway. And a lot of the themes of this letter, it's a 2-page letter, and there's a link, you can find it at this Fox News site, interestingly enough, because it was mostly conservative media sources that covered the presence of these books on the Navy reading list. They became very controversial. But the letter itself used a lot of anti-trans narratives and language that would later become common in legislative debates in the past couple of years. It was kind of a precursor of the wave of anti-trans legislation that would be coming down the path. You can read the letter for yourself. The full letter is at this link. But they send their letter things like, these books aim to disrupt the nuclear family. They were Marxist. Some of my colleagues would be surprised that something I wrote would be called Marxist. But we can have a conversation about that. And the books defy the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They saw these as very anti-American books across the board, all 3 of them, and not appropriate for the Navy to include on a list. And this is a list that the Navy recommends that sailors read at some point in their Navy career. The Navy buys copies of these books for libraries on ships at sea. So it becomes a part of the Navy's educational process. They also have books about how to tie a knot and things like that, more Navy-like things, I assume. But I think they were branching out to more issues of diversity and inclusion, and that's why they included some of these other titles, including mine. Now, this letter and controversy gained traction, mostly in conservative media. So a lot of these stories are from the Rupert Murdoch Empire, New York Post, Fox News. Navy won't remove anti-American books from reading list. House Republicans protest more books on Navy reading list. Woke books have no place in U.S. Navy training. National Review, a very conservative and influential conservative opinion magazine. The Navy's reading program undermines America's security. From The Hill, which is not necessarily always an ideological outlet, but the authors of that op-ed were fellows of the Heritage Foundation, which is a very prominent conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. Another headline, and this is the one from Campus Reform, from the journalist who initially contacted me. Woke books authored by anti-racist profs infiltrate U.S. Navy reading list. The mainstream media, or non-conservative media, really didn't cover this. I think most people would have looked at this list and said, yeah, this is good. The Navy's getting inclusive. The Navy's expanding its sources of information for sailors. But in particular in the conservative media, this resonated for some reason. Ben Shapiro, a famous influencer on the right, tweeted about these books, in particular my book. Now, luckily, I wasn't on this social media outlet at the time, so it was good that I'm a bit of a hermit in that regard in social media. So I didn't get a lot of criticism directly. He didn't tag me in these comments, but they were up there. They did get some attention. He says that my book casts any opposition to LGBT agenda items as grounded in animus. Well, the Supreme Court has said the same thing, so I'm in good company. But that's what he said about the book, as well as the other books in the list. And this pressure campaign was successful. It came up in congressional hearings with military leaders from members of Congress, drawing from the conservative media campaign and that derived from this letter. And On the 2022 version of this list, the books do not appear. And one of the members of Congress who was still in Congress, Congressman Lamborn, wrote in a press release from that year, "I commend Admiral Gilday for removing these toxic books from the Navy's recommended reading list." Now, these books are still available. I don't think they've thrown the books overboard or anything on the ships, so people can still read them, I presume. They're just not in an honor or privilege place on the Navy's recommended reading list. And I think it's an early example. This is kind of a test run in many ways, I think, for what would come in terms of broader understandings of this issue and broader campaigns to remove books about race and gender and sexuality from schools and libraries across the board. So hopefully you have a lot of good questions about this issue. Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and the work that I do. So just some background on me. My mom was a high school librarian. We always observed Banned Books Week. I really wanted to understand why Judy Blume was always on the list. I loved Judy Blume's books. So when I went to get my doctorate, I knew what I wanted to study. Why do people ban books? So that's basically what my book banning in 21st century America is about. A new edition should be coming out, I guess in 2025. I've just signed the contract today, so I will be working on that. It came out in 2015. I update this slide every so often because I like the new designs that are coming out talking about book banning. So all I got was smarter when I read banned books. And of course, for those of you who don't know, LeVar Burton was the honorary host for Banned Books Week this year. So it's nice to have Reading Rainbow on there. This is also just one of my favorite posters, which is think for yourself and let others do the same. So I do like to talk a little bit about where we are right now. So these are the numbers from 2022, but I think it's really good to see the increase in the numbers over time. So in 2020, there were only 223 challenge titles sent to the American Library Association, and then you see these huge jumps. This is not a coincidence. The pandemic had a lot to do with this. Many of you, I'm sure, had school on your dining room table. Your parents were like, "What are you doing? Are you really doing school?" But also they were able to hear what was going on while you were taking your classes. And for those of you who are parents out there, you know that school is often a black box, right? Your kid goes to school, they come home, you ask them how it was, they said it was fine, that's about it, right? There is no information. But during the pandemic, there was much more information. In fact, people were quite concerned about some of the information that they saw. You should also know that we are on track for 2023 to have even more book challenges than there were in 2022. When I say book challenge, I use that term instead of saying book banning, because book banning means a particular thing. It means the removal of a book. A challenge is when someone says, "I have a problem with this book and I'd like you to reconsider it." So we count challenges. The outcome can be a banning, but is not necessarily. What I study is something called censorship practices, and I'll go through these very quickly. So I look at something called the 4 R's. That's redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. So these are the outcomes that can come from when someone brings a challenge. So redaction is when someone marks through something. So like if you're looking at classified documents or documents that have people's personal information, it will be redacted. So this actually happened recently with Mouse, you might have heard, by Art Spiegelman, was banned eventually in McMinn County, Tennessee. But they actually started to do was they wanted to just mark through words. This is actually kind of a joke with librarians, I'll just let you know, because often librarians get like lots of books that have been marked through. So like 4-letter words, someone will be like, that's not a word, I'm gonna mark through it. Recently there was a picture going around because someone put masking tape over the title. I think it was the word devil in the title, right? So someone was like, we shouldn't say that word. So they just put masking tape on the title, on the cover, and like sent it back. But of course, you know, it's plastic, so you can just take it off and you can see it. So that's redaction. Restriction and relocation, it's important to know who the audience is for a particular work. So when something is restricted, this means that it's placed behind the desk. That's the easiest way to think about it. You need permission of some sort to be able to look at it. Either you have to ask, usually the librarian or the teacher, may I read this book? Or your parents have to send in a permission slip, something of that sort. What it does is it impedes access to that book, right? It means that you have to go through all of these hoops to be able to read this particular book. Relocation is when it is placed in a different section than where it's actually supposed to be. So if you're in a public library, this would be something that was meant for the YA section. It's written for teens, but someone says this is actually an adult book and should be moved over to the adult books. Recently, we've been seeing a lot of the, I'll just call them gauzy fantasies by Sarah Maas and Jennifer Armentrout showing up a lot. The Something of Something books are, they are for teens, older teens, but people are saying these books have too much sex in them, and so they are really for adults. So that would be a relocation. Removal is when something is taken out of a particular so out of a collection. So, but it's important to know that it's a different request depending on the context. So removing something from a public library is not the same thing as removing something from the curriculum. That's not the same thing as removing something from a school library. That's not the same thing as removing something from a teacher's classroom library. These all have different effects on the way someone can access this information. So again, that's redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. Those are the 4 R's. More broadly, I study something I call the discourse of censorship. This is how people justify removing information in some way. So I look at the intersection of knowledge, information, and symbolic power. So if someone says something like, I'm a taxpayer, therefore I get to say what happens in a library or a school, and the language that they use to justify that removal. So I'll show you a little bit about what I mean by that. What I'm really looking at is how people discuss reading. So I'm very interested in what does it mean to read? We think reading is incredibly powerful. What do you do in your classes? Your teachers ask you to read stuff. What do I do for my students? I tell them to read stuff. That is because I want you to have this engagement with knowledge, right? I don't actually know what the outcome will be of you doing that, but I do think it is a powerful act, right? To read something, to be able to say, I am going to find out what someone who lived thousands of years ago said about a particular topic. I also talk a lot about books and how incredible books are. Books are an incredible technology that send information across time and space in a very portable package. So I basically look at different types of reading. I'm not going to go through them all right now, because I think the most important thing for what happened with the Navy reading list is actually this idea that if I put this book in front of you, you will interpret it one way. So I talk a lot about Scottish common sense philosophy for any of you who are interested in that. Basically what it says is the words on the page mean what they say and say what they mean. So if you think about, this is very influential in the 18th century with our founding fathers who talked about, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So let me show you how this shows up. Actually, let me talk a little bit about difficult knowledge first. So I will show you how this shows up, especially in that letter. What we see right now really is what I call difficult knowledge. This is actually from Carrie H. Robinson. This is one of my favorite books of all time. She discusses how the information that adults want to censor is often information that we have trouble discussing ourselves. So it's not really about the kids at all. You actually might notice that when you see the pictures of adults, of people screaming at each other at various board meetings, there are rarely any children there, right? They are somewhere else. This is really much more about what do we as adults find uncomfortable and unable to really express. And therefore, we assume that people who are younger than us, children, will have difficulty doing this. What Carrie Robinson says is that, in fact, it is very important that we don't censor information, because that is how you gain agency over yourself and understanding of the world. If you don't have the vocabulary to be able to describe yourself, your friends, your community, your nation, the world, space, right? All of these things, how can you actually flourish as a human being? So what actually happens is that people deny children agency to be able to say, you know, this is what is important to me. This is what is important to my friends. And I want to be able to have the words to express it. So this is actually directly from the letter. So they go through and say a lot of things, but they say specifically, these books give neither detached nor balanced descriptions of the controversies in our society, have no place on a military reading list. They aim to disrupt the nuclear family and call for constitutional violations, such as Kennedy's advocacy for discrimination by the federal government against Americans according to their race. He writes, quote, "The defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is inequity, then it is racist." Emphasis added. Kennedy's argument rests on the premise that our nation's founding was inherently racist, including the Constitution sailors swear to uphold. So if you look at this, what they are saying is that there's only one way to interpret what Kennedy says here. I do not know if you agree with him or don't agree with him, but what they are saying is that there's only one way to do this, and I call this a common sense interpretation of texts. So what it sort of does is deny agency to the reader themselves, right? You were just looking at this text, and obviously you were in agree with them that this rests on the premise that the nation's founding was inherently racist, including Constitution and Constitution sailors swear to uphold. You, as readers, may or may not agree with that. But what they are saying is that, in fact, the way that we interpret this text is the only possible way that someone can do it. So when I was doing the Senate Judiciary Committee, you can find the video online, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana read out Genderqueer to me, which I have read. And the way he read it was as if it is self-evident that this is a problem. I'm like, well, is it? It is for some people. It's not for everybody. And honestly, I've had this section read out to me so many times that I don't even think about it anymore. So when you think about this idea that text means what it says and says what it means, that's not really understanding how people read. Everyone brings their own baggage to text. So yes, this could have been in the Navy. Who knows what the various people, millions of people in the Navy would have thought about this particular text. I also want to emphasize that censorship is both insidious and futile. So it is insidious because it removes this immediate access. But it's also this sort of thing where the book is still available. You can go lots of places and get the book yourself. You can torrent it, I'm sure, right? It is very easy to get these. So what are people trying to do? Censorship is often quite symbolic. It means that I am trying to say, these are what my values are, and you must share them. So I just want to end with this. This is something I'm ending with a lot in the talks that I give. This is the motto for the Freedom to Read Foundation, which is the legal arm of the American Library Association. One of the strange things about the testimony I've been giving is that I feel like I am giving a very conservative argument, right? What could be more mom and apple pie than saying, you have the freedom to read? This is part of your First Amendment rights. We as free people have the freedom to read. In fact, it is in the UN Declaration of Human Rights for every person on the planet the right to freedom of expression and to hear ideas from any and all sides. So I just leave you with this thought. Please read banned books. Please be sure, wherever you are, to get involved in your local community civic process, to vote, to show up for meetings when someone actually imposes their own power over you and says, I am going to decide what you are able to read, or I'm going to decide what your children should read. That is not how we should live as Americans, because in fact, free people read freely. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. When I had the idea for this panel, it was inspired by Dr. Pierceson's book being removed from the Navy reading list, and I just Googled leading expert on banned books, and Emily Knox's name came up, and luckily she works at the U of I right down the road. So I'm so grateful that both of these scholars were able to come together to provide this unique context about something that a lot of us have been hearing about and maybe are interested in learning more about. And so one of my first questions is for both of you, but I'll start with Dr. Pierceson. So which got more publicity for the book Sexual Minorities? Was it when it was added to the Navy reading list, or was it when this campaign was started to try to get it removed?
Well, I think it was definitely with the campaign.
Yeah.
No one really noticed when it was added all that much, at least outside of the Navy, very likely. The public notice or activist notice really came to light after it was highlighted by those members of Congress. They went to conservative media and used these very powerful phrases like un-American and woke. That, and it was also what was also going on, as we may get to as well in our broader discussion. There were currents of opposition to inclusion and diversity going on from other parts of the conservative movement, from think tanks and conservative media, attacking the study of race in schools and gender and sexuality. So I think it was part of a larger pattern. It was at the early moment, but it certainly was seen as evidence of what's gone wrong with elite institutions like the Navy. But the Navy itself didn't see it as a problem until pressure was placed on them to do something about those books.
Yeah, and that's what it sounded like. And from all this opposition that mounted, did you find many groups coming to the defense of the book at this time, or was this a little bit before this was getting on as many groups' radars? Or
I think it was at the early on in the process, and I think some of the other books, Kendi's book and the new Jim Crow probably got more of the public conversation because they are more visible scholars, and these books have probably more cultural notoriety and exposure. So a lot of the conversation, even on news shows and in the media, was about those books and not about my books as much, although you would find people swooping my book into this larger narrative about the dangers of inclusive thinking in the Navy.
Well, and it makes sense to draw attention to the books that people had heard of, and it is good company to be in to have your book recognized. And so I'm going to put this question to Dr. Knox. So there's this paradox in which people seek to censor or remove books that are like works of historical literature or that are bestsellers that everybody has heard of and can easily access. And so you describe censorship efforts as insidious but futile. And I'm wondering if you can say more about why they hold so much attention from people on both sides who both support some of these movements but also really resist them when we know that information is maybe still available.
Well, I honestly think because it's about books. Books are just really important to people. I won't ask you to raise your hand, but how many of you break the spines of your books? That is a very that's a very common response, even though a book is a mass market good. Because we think about books in particular ways, they have an almost magical power over people. I didn't go into this, but I actually trace it to the Reformation and the doctrine of sola scriptura, which means that you can save your soul by reading a book, the Bible. This is something that has actually come down to us from the Reformers in the way that we think about books in many ways. Also, the Reformers talked about how there's the priesthood of all believers, which is that no one is between you and your interpretation of this book. So if you think about the power that was imbued in scriptures that way, it gives you a better idea of how we think about texts in general. So this is why people get very upset. I mean, when I was writing my book, I went to some book hearings on various books, and they're always exciting. People get very angry. They get very worked up about the books. And also you realize that the books are just a trigger for other things, right? It's like a way of going into talking about much larger issues in society. So someone will start by talking about a book like Sexual Minorities and Politics, but they'll end up talking about the destruction of the nuclear family, as you saw. Like, that's just how that works. I have seen that so many times in my research because it's not really about the book, it's about what the book represents, and an idea that if we can not have this book in circulation, then we can keep things the way they are. We can keep to the status quo. Because if people read about this, they'll believe it, right? That's also the other thing that you can see that comes from the Reformation, right? This idea of belief in what texts say. So it's all sorts of things wrapped up together, which is why it's a great area to study. So I'm wondering, Dr. Pierceson, if you could talk about maybe whether this had a chilling effect on you as a researcher, or how this may potentially affect other scholars who want to do this kind of work, and the other actors besides the readers. So we've talked a lot about them, who see these efforts to restrict information and reading material. So how does that affect the people who produce this knowledge, or who are the educators, or the librarians?
Well, I think librarians are the ones who are on the front lines of this, obviously, a lot of these political conflicts. I myself didn't feel much direct effect. It doesn't really have an effect the way I think about my scholarship or my intentions about producing future scholarship. But I also think that for some people, they see this as a model that worked and that was successful, and they've been trying to replicate it in other areas. It's local schools, library commissions, library boards, things like that. So I think one of the signals for at least activists who support bans like this is that pressure can work. And in this case, the pressure on the Navy worked. And I think one of the reasons why this was a lightning rod for a lot of conservatives, particularly on this topic of why these are such symbolic fights. I think a lot of conservatives saw the Navy as their institution. Whereas these quote-unquote woke ideas might have infiltrated higher education, a lot of people thought, well, at least the Navy is still a conservative place where Fox News is played on military bases, and the conservative media dominates a lot of military discourse, which may or may not be true, but I think that's their perception. I think that's why some conservatives were particularly offended that these books were put on a Navy reading list, because it was the Navy, it was the military. They probably would have been fine in a college seminar maybe, but the Navy was a bridge too far for a lot of folks.
Yeah, that's interesting. So these conflicts, Dr. Knox, you talk about how these have been going on for as long as books have existed, the symbolic power of what a book can do, how it can transform not just individuals but societies, is something that it's weighty. We have some sense that is true. So these disputes are ongoing. We see them occurring in the halls of Congress. We see them occurring in local school boards. And recently we saw the state of Illinois step in to enact legislation that is trying to preempt local and public libraries from restricting books on ideological grounds or removing books from libraries on ideological grounds. And so I'm wondering, this is for both of you, a scholar of political science and a scholar of intellectual book bans. And I'm wondering, when these conflicts happen, what are the trade-offs with resolving them at these different levels of say, governance or shared collective decision-making? So from like the local community school board to a state legislature to Congress to like the Supreme Court.
Oh, okay. So what this really shows is how distributed our school system is. So these are very local fights. They actually tear apart communities. I've had people call me and say, like, my neighbor no longer speaks to me because of this book that they were upset about at some point. In fact, there's not much that Congress can actually do about this because we have such a distributed system of districts for our public institutions. You should know that this is unique in, the global north. Most places, a lot of there are not these distributed systems, so any information, any decisions made up at the top just are imposed from the top. So that makes it both difficult and also easier to respond, because you can just go to your local school board and stand up and say how you feel about something. The organizing is actually much easier because you're just organizing your neighbors. I will speak to the Illinois law a little bit. So this law actually says that you will not receive grant money from the state if you do not have within your policy a reconsideration policy that includes reference to the Freedom to Read statement, the ALA Bill of Rights. These are guidelines that have been developed by ALA over time. So it's actually a policy bill, and it both provides cover for librarians in smaller towns who might say, well, we have to do this in order to get money. But I think it's a good first step. There's much more that can be done to support local libraries and schools.
Yeah, I think it is a remarkably local fight that's going on. But I think it also has some national connections and some national motivators. A lot of the groups behind this wave, including what happened with the Navy and the ongoing fights, a lot of the folks are very well financed think tanks and folks on the right, Heritage Foundation, as I mentioned, others, Manhattan Institute, a think tank. You may have heard the name Christopher Rufo, who's a leading conservative intellectual who's been at the center of the fight against having frank conversations about race in classrooms as well as gender identity. So there are intellectuals and very powerful activists and very wealthy donors who are behind a movement to use these local fights to ban books, to limit access to books. So oftentimes if you go to engage local school board meetings, you might be not engaging with local school board members, but activists who have informed those school board members and given money to those school board members and intellectual firepower in their arguments. So it is, I think, a very hyper local, but also very much of a national fight about contemporary ideology, and that involves a lot of the actors we know from more national politics.
Yeah, and, in political science, we see that nationalization of politics seep into all kinds of policy debates. And so, I guess it's not surprising that this would happen in fights over local school curricula or library materials. But I'm wondering, when we think about how people become involved in politics, political scientists for a century have been wanting to encourage more Americans to get involved in local elections, local politics, run for your school board, know what's going on at your school, school board meetings. And the pandemic was really a galvanizing time, as Dr. Knox noted, for parents becoming both more aware of what was being taught in school, but being really concerned with school district policies related to masking and social distancing and school closures. So some parents are starting to go to school board meetings, and some of them are maybe simultaneously realizing, oh, there's things with the curriculum that either they're hearing from national level actors that they should, become alarmed, or maybe just they themselves decide to take up this issue like a policy entrepreneur. And so I wanted to ask both of you about this idea that a lot of people are highly mobilized by these hyper local but like nationally tinged debates that have to do with the culture war, and it doesn't seem like this is moderating our politics. So, as more people become politically involved, does that just kind of reinforce the polarization that we see? Is it a good thing for democracy if more people are fighting about these things at a local level? What is it doing?
I think it's always a good thing when more people are fighting in politics and more people are active. Maybe not, civilly, of course, and
Sure.
and in a nice way. But I think there's some evidence that this very ultra ban position, ban everything, ban all these books, it's a small group. And I think that there's been a lot of counter-mobilization of people. We saw, there's initial assessments of this. We'll probably have to look at more of this as more facts come in the coming days and weeks. But it looks like a lot of these local fights were not won by the book banners. There's been some pushback and counter-mobilization by local activists and parents and people at the grassroots level pushing back against school boards that have done this or want to do this sort of thing. So I think the story is being written about how that will play out. And I don't think it is a story fully closed that it's all about book banning. I think there is some opposition to that. And that's a good thing. But I think in general it's good to have these conversations more and more at the local level.
So the way I think about it is really that the grassroots right, whether it's AstroTurf or not, has always been very good at organizing on the local level. And it is a part of American democracy that other political actors have ceded to the right. What I spend a lot of my time doing is trying to encourage people who do not support book bans to run for office. There's often a complacency or an idea that someone else will do it. There's no one else. You have to do it yourself. No one is coming to save you, which is something that I would say the political right understands very well, and that the political left, center, far left, all sorts of places, anarchists, do not seem to understand very well, right? There's always sort of an idea that, will it be genuine? An idea that politics at this level is not authentic or something like that. We really need to support our local institutions, because I truly believe that what the push is is really to get rid of these local institutions, right? To lower the tax base for public schools and public libraries so that they no longer exist. This is actually a threat in Michigan and Oregon, a few other places that are actually thinking about closing their public libraries. I just do not think that we can be complacent about it. Somebody has to be on the school board, and so why not you? That's the way I try to tell people to talk about it. Also, you have to vote.
Thank you for that. And on the point of school board elections yesterday, hundreds of school boards had their elections, and some that had really heated conflicts over policies that boards had enacted that were making it easier for parents to challenge books or request which lists of which books were in the library. Some of those school boards were ousted completely and replaced by people that were advocating against policies like this. I know the third largest school district in Pennsylvania replaced all of their conservative school board members because people ran against this kind of a policy. And so, I know we can see certain efforts as maybe anti-democratic, but I like that Dr. Pierceson says, actually, this is democracy in action at the hyper-local level, where if people don't like it, then they mobilize and they can work to change it. But the complacency, as Dr. Knox noted, is the thing that we have to remind ourselves not to do that. And in light of these greater fights about like public education and schools, there's a parallel to something else, and I think this might resonate with some of the younger people in the room and people with like younger siblings. So these movements to restrict information, it's about books, but it's also about like what we think information or ideas might make young people do. What it's exposing them to, behaviors, ideas. And so there's recently been a big push to regulate social media and access to online pornography for young people. And we've been seeing a lot of state legislatures enact legislation. In the last few years, there's been 38 bills that were introduced by different state governments, a majority of which were Republican controlled, but a quarter of these state legislatures were democratically controlled, and then the others were mixed Democratic and Republican control. And these lawmakers are trying to pass legislation that regulates children's data privacy, but also gives parents more access to their social media. That would basically make it so if you are a person under the age of 18, you want to get on Snapchat or TikTok, your parents have to give you permission, but then also they have access to everything. And so these are becoming a little more popular. There's also been, the state of Montana has restricted TikTok. This is coming, from mostly the right, but I'm wondering if there's any parallels in what the purpose of trying to restrict information is that you see, or if these are sides of a different coin.
So my overall feeling is that these are the easy way out, honestly. So it's also pointless. How many of you know how to use VPNs to get around your filter? I mean, it's just not worth the time. And the actual work that needs to be done is what is now called social emotional learning, which is that you need to educate young people on how social media works, and we need to give them the tools to do that. So I talk a lot about education and discernment when I'm giving talks about this. Yes, TikTok, all of these things can lead to poor mental health outcomes. But I don't know that saying that you can't look at it will actually lead to better mental health outcomes. What we actually need to deal with is the mental health of our young people. And that is much more expensive and much harder and takes more resources than just passing a law. These are easy solutions that make people feel better, like they are doing something. But the actual solutions take a lot more time, effort, and caring and work. I spend a lot of time, I do a lot of research on filters, actually, and just how pointless they are. They're actually used as ways as classroom management. That's really what they do. So the teachers are like, well, I don't want kids on Facebook, so they can't be on, or whatever it was at various times. So I'll just turn on this filter so you can't use it. It really has nothing to do with what is going on there. And are we training, when we do that, are we giving young people the skills to interact with these new media?
I think what worries me about that conversation about this issue from an LGBTQ rights perspective is that harm to children has long been a front and center trope about expansion of LGBTQ rights. And a lot of people are using those laws as a way to make the argument that, or using the argument to support those laws by saying that merely talking about queer and trans people is obscene and needs to be banned as unsuitable for young people. And so I think a lot of those laws really quickly spill over into kinds of censorship, or at least are motivated by a desire to erase a discussion of queer and trans people in the public sphere. And they often frame that in terms of their perceived or their argued harm to children.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I guess my last question is, when it comes to, especially at the local level, there are some people who have, taken this up as their cause. I read a Washington Post story about a woman who went to a school board meeting, heard about some bad books, and then she decided she was going to start reading every single book in the library. And there are these serial filers who are responsible for like 60% of these book challenges. And some of them might be affiliated with a national organization, but some of them are just really obsessed with this project, and they believe that teenagers reading about sex is going to make them have sex, and that's like they have this belief. And so when we're thinking about the different intent of book challenges, like, does it matter what the intent is, or the different kinds of things that you talked about, the 4 types of restriction? Should we ask what the intent is if any of these are in good faith, not maybe the example I gave, but different efforts to at least have the conversation about the material that is available, or given a priority for young people, let's say.
So I approach this in 2 different ways, which is, first of all, a lot of this is about not trusting experts. So it is really the idea that I know better than the librarian, the teacher, whomever. But it also is a way of saying that I don't believe that certain people have agency. So if they read this book, I know what the outcome will be. And it's not going to happen to me. It's okay if I read this book. That's the other thing that happens a lot. But if someone else does, well, then it will just be apocalyptic terror everywhere. That's not really how people read, and it's not really treating people as full human beings. That's really what I find so problematic about censorship practices in general, which is that they are actually quite paternalistic. They're imposing people's own values and ideas over others. And this is from any point on the political spectrum. It's basically saying, I know what is best, and I don't trust you to actually respond to this particular text in a way that is in keeping with my own values or something of that sort. You have no way of knowing that. There are many of you out in the audience. I don't know how you will respond to anything in particular that I read to you. You all will respond quite differently. I, in fact, have to trust that you will respond in a way that, is caring and helpful to people, and that you have thought about things and are learning more about yourselves and other people every day. It does take, instead of just imposing my own ideas onto you as to how you would read something.
I think a lot of what people think about when it comes to education or reading, people tend to, their first instinct, I think, with education is indoctrination. I think everybody does that. Parents indoctrinate their children into their values. And that's not to say that college professors indoctrinate their students. Trust me, I don't think I've ever changed a student's mind about anything. You're all pretty stubborn in general, but I think I think a lot of people conceive of education as a form of indoctrination. Here are the books to read. Here are the scriptural passages to read in this church. Here's what we believe. And I think that's a very powerful prism in which a lot of people view this issue, and how books should be a part of that conversation. So I think I think that has to be challenged and overcome, but I think that's a powerful prism that a lot of people use.
Well, thank you. Well, I think that's a great point to open this up to your questions in the audience. So I'm going to hand this over to Rod and our co-moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you for our panel tonight. We appreciate that. I bet from hearing the discussion that they've had here and with Dr. Wade that a lot of questions are running through your mind. So we're just going to be flooded with questions tonight as far as addressing our panel, and maybe it's kind of like the old stump the panel type thing. You know, what kind of questions do you have that is intriguing to you? So open it up to that. We do need to make sure the microphone gets to you, not only for this room, but for those online. So we have some questions. Yes, sir.
Sir, the Navy, my understanding now, with them expanding to a 10-week basic training, it used to be 8 weeks. Part of that additional time is to teach them better to be inclusive, to be more accepting of those that are different. And the timing-wise, I don't know when that change made, and so I'm curious with your connection with that, how did that timing work with their various censorship associations?
Well, I think your point is correct that the military has been diversifying in a lot of ways. I think the military knows that it needs to speak in terms of recruitment to a much more diverse audience, much more diverse group of potential recruits. I think the military is realizing that diversity is a value for the military. There's power in diversity and the knowledge of diversity. So I think this was one small part of that effort. I think what the Navy did was linked into these general and military efforts. I don't think what happened with these books on the Navy list has stopped the military from having that more inclusive approach in other areas, but I think that they certainly are connected and more connected. But you might know more about, I know less about basic training and that sort of thing as much as the Navy issue in this case.
So I don't know anything about what is going on with the Navy, but what I will say is that the under 18 generation is already majority minority, for those of you who don't. So just imagine who all these 18-year-olds are on these boats, right? They are not a bunch of white kids. They are, in fact, part of this demographic shift that we have had in this country. I often feel, when I was reading through the letter, I was like, these people don't seem to know anything about what the world is like in the military right now. They don't seem to have any idea of who is joining the military. I'm sure many of you have relatives that are in the military. I do. They do not match anything like the people who sent that letter, right? So when I think about that, I'm like, well, of course the Navy needs to talk about inclusiveness because you have to have cohesion in your units, and you are going to be dealing with people who are very different from you. So I actually think that their work actually went against military readiness because who knows if someone would agree with Kendi and Michelle, Alexander and your book, like that's not really how it works. And this is actually crucial for our military readiness.
Ma'am, a quick question for you. Well, we'll see if it's quick. You had talked about the mental health issues with our youth, and my understanding with discussions I've had before is that the youth at this point, we are not going to get back to a healthy status for at least another decade. The kids that grew up stuck at home for potentially years and with a lack of social environment thanks to COVID, the pandemic, the quarantine, do you agree that we are looking at a very effectively another generation before we can get out from under this problem?
I actually talk about in my my longer talks that I give that we don't actually know what the outcome of the pandemic will be. So the outcome of the plague, for any of you, the Black Death, was the destruction of feudalism. An entire way of living ended. The initial outcomes of the pandemic are, in fact, a loosening of child labor laws. So you may not be aware of this, but in Arkansas, they have made it so that children can now work. Of course, there's only certain children who will be working. Not everybody's children will be affected by these laws. And why is that? I cannot prove this, but is because we lost so many people in the service sector during the pandemic. How can we even begin to talk about the mental health of our children if we don't have universal health care? I don't know what else to say, right? Like, we don't actually take anybody's health seriously. Yeah, I mean, that's not even dental, right? Like, none of these things are even on the radar. So, yes, we will. It was very damaging, but I really think that, of course it was. We lost 1 million people. I just looked up the stats. People who are just gone from our society. We have not even wrestled with that. And in order for you to get the help you need to have a good job that provides basic mental health care to wrestle with whoever you might have lost during the pandemic.
Thank you for that question. Where else we got? We got one down front there, Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you. So recently I've seen an emergence of video essays on the loneliness epidemic, just to continue on about mental health, and the loss of third places such as libraries, coffee shops. Do you think that this loss of third places could be also affecting the opinions people have on certain pieces of literature and books, like not being able to talk to a lot of people and communicate their ideas to be able to understand such complex opinions?
Oh, that is a great question. So I am very concerned about the loss of third places. So libraries provide so many services. I'm sure some of you saw the pictures during the pandemic of people parked outside of libraries to use the Wi-Fi. I'm sure many of you went to libraries after school because that's where you went. There was nowhere else for you to go. Older people go. They still have newspapers. They are warming and cooling centers. I would say that these services in general are part of the problem if we lose libraries. Libraries are great places for civic engagement. So the League of Women Voters often do their, not even debates, but just like presentation of people who are running for elections at libraries. If we lose libraries, where are these things going to happen? I don't know. Illinois is kind of interesting because I grew up in Maryland where everybody is libraried because libraries are run by counties and everybody lives in a county. And so when I moved here and I found out there are people who do not have access to public libraries, I was appalled. I'm still appalled by it. I just moved from Champaign to Bloomington, but in Champaign, the small unincorporated places outside of Champaign-Urbana do not have access to library. I don't even know what to think about that, right?
It's Springfield too, Grandview and places.
Oh,
like
I
that
just.
are not part of that membership.
I don't know what that means for those communities, right? It really is a loss of place. How this affects things like books, what it happens is that it means that people are like, well, what does it matter if libraries are closing? I never had access to the library anyway.
I'll talk about the politics of this a bit. I mean, it's the destruction of these spaces is intentional for some people. I mean, the attack on public education censorship of books and criticism of teachers is part of a political movement that's trying to privatize public education with vouchers and moving to private schools instead of public schools. A lot of people in the political world don't think that these public goods of public schools and public libraries are worth having anymore, or they might be counter to their political values or narratives. And so part of what's going on is that these battles are often a proxy war for that fight over these very important, crucial public institutions that are really anchors of public discourse, public education, and public intercourse.
Thank you. Other questions? We've got several here. Got one, Sophia? Okay, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. I am also a professor in school politics and international affairs. Dr. Knox, everything that you've said has been so helpful this evening. Thank you so much. I have a question for you, Dr. Pierceson. For myself, when I encountered a book ban as a college student, you know this longer version of the story, I was the president of a LGBT organization, and the book that was banned was a prominent LGBT novel. And a national news organization called me, and my quote to them was, "Our lives are not obscene," because that was what charges were leveled against this book. So I was wondering, for you, does it feel personal at all that your book was treated in this way and the language that's used against it? I know that we're in a time where things can be dangerous for professors. We saw a couple of weeks ago on the ASU campus where Turning Point activists pushed an LGBT professor to the ground and bloodied his nose. I was just wondering that the attacks feel very personal. If you could share that.
I think I'm concerned about those kinds of attacks, and I do think things have been ratcheted up in some contexts. At the same time, I feel a lot of privilege because of academic freedom, and I think our campus is one where it's a respectful place, and I don't really feel those directly, but I can see colleagues experiencing very similar kind of experiences, and it does cross my mind. Particularly, I think it was a great thing that I wasn't very active on social media when this blew up initially, because I didn't get a lot of the harassment or intimidation from people who are very passionate about these issues. So I was a little bit lucky. Other scholars, Ibram X. Kendi is, he's very under threat, physically, personally, reputationally, and scholars like him and others. So there are a lot of folks who are much more prominent than I am, I think, who face the brunt of this much more. And I think it's increasingly, particularly because there is this narrative that there's this big problem of indoctrination on college campuses, and some people feel they have to fight against that. That really motivates them to maybe do things they might not otherwise do, and leads to maybe physical altercations. I think that's an exception than the norm, but certainly it's a possibility and something to think about.
Hi, I come from a small community that has been affected by book bans and by think tanks that have mobilized and tried to push the agenda that books to discuss race and LGBTQ politics or culture, it tore apart my hometown. Private businesses, private bookstores were under attack because of it. Public libraries, my school, my high school. So what happens next? How do we repair this fragmentation of my community? What are some good steps to take, or is there no solution right now?
Mm-hmm. That is a great question, and my first answer is that there isn't a solution right now. I have yet to hear where there is a solution. It's sort of a it's just something that has to be, probably time is the only thing, and also working to make repairs, right, over time. We still see scars from the Civil War in this country, we are still living through all sorts of things. So in a small town, I would say that it will only take time, and probably the scars will always be there.
Other questions?
I have one over here. Okay. Oh, okay. Hi,
So I couldn't help but think about like the mint julep textbooks and like the lost cause perspective. So is there any type of like correlation between banning books and then also rewriting history? And do you think that's more dangerous to rewrite the narrative for schools versus just banning a book?
Well, I do think that is part of the agenda of book banning. It's to make sure a certain narrative stays in place or gets locked in place or reestablished or reaffirmed. My expertise is more with LGBTQ rights, and certainly people who oppose talking about gender and sexuality in elementary school or high schools, they want to make sure that that's happened so that people don't talk about those issues after those educational experiences or ever. There really is, I think, a sincere effort by folks in the religious right to exterminate sexual and gender minorities from the public sphere. And that's part of the censorship agenda. If you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. If you don't read about it, it doesn't exist. And I think the same is true with lost cause narratives. I mean, I tell students this a lot. I grew up in rural northern Illinois, and I watched the Dukes of Hazzard and had a car with a Confederate flag on it as a kid. And that was normal. That was an essential, and I never questioned that. No one in my school questioned that. No, that was a normal thing. So as recently as the 1980s, the lost cause narrative was very powerful in rural Illinois, and it still might be. So I think that's a big part of this debate as well, is trying to create or maintain or preserve those narratives and prevent a more inclusive approach.
Yeah, I would actually say that a lot of this is actually about lost causism. In fact, what we see is that a lot of the books, especially by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are pushing against the greater lost cause narrative. That is basically what Kendi's book is, right? But there are people who feel very strongly that any discussion of the United States has to be triumphant in a particular way. In fact, that is part and parcel of lost causism, like that we can't even discuss why this war happened truthfully, because it's sort of like a feeling like if we discuss it truthfully, then what happens next, right? Will I be personally implicated? I didn't show these slides, but one of my favorite things to talk about is Moms for Liberty and the Wit and Wisdom in Tennessee, their curriculum. They were very upset about Ruby Bridges' book. It's called Ruby Bridges, My Story. So Ruby Bridges is still alive. She desegregated her school. And what they were particularly upset about were pictures of people hurling slurs at Ruby, all these sorts of things. And what I realize is that, people know who those people are in those pictures. Those people are either still alive or just recently have died. And in fact, how do you wrestle with the implication of what that means for your family? I think that's really hard for a lot of people, but it's important work to do, right? I often talk about what do we owe to the people who were on this land before? We are all implicated in that, right? How do we talk about Indigenous people here in what is now the United States? I try not to think about that with agony or somehow this makes me a terrible person. It's part of our history that is important, and it's important that we talk about it. So I often feel like all of this is of a piece. It's just a way of talking about, as I said, with the difficult knowledge, right? We are dealing with difficult knowledge that is even difficult for adults to talk about, much less how do you talk to someone who's the same age as Ruby Bridges, who is 6. She's very cute in her little Mary Janes, right? And how do you tell someone who's also 6, yes, these people treated this little girl that way?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ken Page with the ACLU, It's good to see you, Dr. Knox.
Yep.
Appreciate you and your work. Dr. Pierceson. You know, not only banning books, it has gone over to curriculum at college levels, and there's a huge racial overtone, especially coming out of Florida with curriculum, and that discussion of curriculum. But Dr. Pierceson, this is, you know, Illinois has an inclusive law, curriculum law. And so that may be helpful for small towns. I'm not exactly sure what to do with that, because what we did as the ACLU, we approached, we had that discussion, and we had those questions. How do we just wanted to find out how the school districts were implementing the inclusive curriculum. And of course, a lot of them closed the door on us, which was okay, you know, but Springfield District 186, I think they were afraid to close the door on me. And so they said, well, we will put you on our curriculum council. So our first meeting is this month. I'm not exactly sure how that will look. You know, it beats the heck out of us, the ACLU, having to go through FOIA to find this out and everything. But what we want to do, what our position is, that we would like to know how they're doing it, and do they need help in implementing it? Because we have organizations out there that said they would like to help them implement it. If they needed resources, books, since we're talking about banned books, you know, it's going to look very different from what some people, maybe what people want to ban anyway. So, you know, that's something. Have you looked at that? How the schools are doing that in Illinois now? They should have started to implement it.
Well, I haven't researched it fully, but I do know that there's often a gap between what a law at the state level says and what local school boards do. And this gets back to this local control. You know, the state of Illinois can have all kinds of mandates, but those may not be carried out by local school board officials, because those teachers, those principals, they're listening to the school board and the parents, not necessarily the governor or legislators, because their direct curriculum is given by the school board. So school boards can still have some wiggle room, and if someone's not watching, or if someone's not asking those questions, they can get away with not following those laws on race and sexual orientation and indigenous folks. And so I think Illinois is doing a good job at being more inclusive, and Asian Americans. I think that was a recent law as well, Asian American history. So those are good steps, but I think the enforcement question is still a big one. Because and against that, a lot of private, I think that's why there's a push for private schools. A lot of private school curriculums are being written by people behind what's called the 1776 Project, Hillsdale College. They're a big purveyor of very conservative narratives about history, erasing race as a problem or as a thicket, downplaying the issue of race in the Civil War and other contexts. So there are a lot of, you know, a question also is what's going on in private schools. What are private schools teaching about inclusion as well?
Other questions? We got time for one or two more.
Thank you, Dr. Knox and Dr. Pierceson. That was a perfect segue from the ACLU person, because my question comes, earlier we talked about how Illinois has certain safeguards put in place now, but some of us will move from Illinois to states that either don't have a protective legislature or executive, or both, as in the case of Florida. Are there other safeguards that, you know, us as future parents or protecting our kids can go through, such as judicial safeguards? Is there any that are currently going on or that we could explore if we're being told, no, we're going to ban this book, we're going to ban CRT, other types of learning?
I would not rely on the judiciary to save you in any way. I am extremely concerned if our current Supreme Court reconsiders Pico v. Island Trees. That will be, I used to be confident in our judiciary having an expansive view of the First Amendment. I am not so sure right now. I do not know how 6 of the justices would decide on that. So I really mean it when I say vote, because these have long-term effects across our nation. You have to work to support your First Amendment rights. They are not just given to you. You have to work to maintain them. And I am not sure how well they would be maintained right now. I'd just be very honest. We are not in a good place with, especially the federal judiciary.
One more. Got a final question?
Right there.
Hi. So I am queer and trans and non-binary, and I feel like what you two have talked about having this access to information, I hold it very close to my heart because I wouldn't have known about my identity if not for access to this information through the internet. I was the first non-binary person that I knew. I wouldn't have known if I didn't have access to these different types of people, these different identities. And thankfully I live in a state where I have been able to get access to healthcare to affirm my identity. But recently, especially in 2023, there's been a lot of regression in trans rights and a lot of silencing of people in my community. Just everything from shutting down trans healthcare across the country and the No Say Gay bill, and even also on the internet with like Elon Musk trying to declare cisgender to be a slur, all of those types of things. And I feel like our country is kind of going in this direction where our rights are kind of being pulled back. And I'm just kind of wondering what us individuals, people in my community can do to address this. Can this be reversed somehow in the next few years, or how long can this take to be addressed, or can it be addressed from an individual level?
So these questions can never be addressed individually, and no one can promise you what the outcome will be. So I am a big believer in collective action. I'm going to make the same encouragement I gave to my students the other day, which is to visit the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. What you will notice if you were there is that there were mostly young people, and they were trained to actually not respond to the hatred that was flung at them. That they actually went through having people yelling, screaming, throwing things at them, all sorts of dogs being, sicked on them. And that is actually what I believe is the response. No one can promise you that things will be better. Whoever says that is not telling the truth. So I am going to be truthful and say that we do not know. It may get better, it may not. All you can do is live your life with integrity and work to make the world better. And I wish I could say more, but this has been a struggle across human history, but in our country since the country was founded. Rights come, they go. We are, I think, really living through a new Reconstructionist era right now, right after Reconstruction, actually, when, free, black people were given lots of rights, and then they were taken away. That is really where we are. I think that is the best way to think about it. Like, I will not say that it will necessarily be easier in so many years. We do not know.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I would say that, you know, just keep fighting, don't give up hope. There are things in the law and in politics that can help. Some judges can be helpful. Some. I mean, the First Amendment is still there, and it still can be used as a vehicle politically and legally in certain contexts. Although I agree that this Supreme Court is probably not the most trustworthy on that front. But I think there is some evidence that censors are overplaying their hand a bit, right? That they're going too far. That some people are getting really fed up with book bans and bashing people in public and undermining people's identity and values. I do think there is some hope in that, but mobilization has to continue, and people have to continue pushing against those forces and not let up. Absolutely.
Great discussion tonight. I mean, I've been to a lot of these, and just the involvement from the audience. I personally appreciate that in your attendance here tonight. First of all, let's have a nice round of applause for our panelists for tonight. We appreciate that. Thank you. You should have seen the objectives on the screen there that was for you to observe. Also, I was given a note during the presentation tonight that the checkout system is not working. So it won't tie you up leaving tonight. You do not have to check out. Thank you for attending tonight. You guys have a great rest of your day and in your semester strong. Thank you.